Understand the scientific revolution, we have to understand where the ideas that people are going to believe for hundreds and hundreds of years are going to come from before the scientific revolution. During the Middle Ages, it was believed that the Earth was the center of the universe because since God made humans, we're the most important thing. Obviously, we're the center of the universe. This was thought to be true by thinkers like Aristotle, Ptolemy. They basically believed that the Earth was the center of the universe. The church backed it up based on the Bible, and that's just what was believed by everybody because that was taught. Skepticism is basically the questioning of things that are believed to be true. The scientific revolution, as well as the Renaissance that we talked about a while ago, are known for their skepticism, questioning things that people forever believed are going to be true. So by questioning all things that are believed, you're making sure that these things that you're being taught are actually true. So it's going to lead to a time of experiments, observation, and using logic and kind of the world around us to see how things really work, to question or to be skeptical whether these things that everybody believed to be true were actually true. Important to know that when Copernicus is going to challenge the geocentric model and replace it with his own, the heliocentric model, basically saying that the sun is the center of our solar system and that the Earth and other planets rotate around it, he wasn't doing it based on observation. He was doing it based on logic. A scientist later on by the name of Kepler is going to start to record the planet's movements, and he's going to also come to the idea that Copernicus's heliocentric model is correct based on his observation and what he's seen. And then later on, again, another person by the name of Galileo, who I'm sure we've talked plenty about, an Italian scientist, is going to use experiments. He's going to be the first one to use a telescope to look at the movement and track the movements of the planets and realize that, okay, yeah, based on observation, based on logic, based on all of the information, that the heliocentric model was true. So it wasn't one scientist that came up with the idea and was able to prove it. The idea was come up with by Copernicus, studied more by Kepler, and really proved by Galileo that the heliocentric model was correct. The reason this is so important is because it's questioning traditional authority. It's questioning the church, what has been believed for so long. And as we know about the church and their traditional ways, they don't like to be questioned, especially about things that they've been teaching for so long. Pope Urban VII is going to put Galileo on trial and basically say, how dare you speak out against the church? You're a heretic. You have two options. Either admit that you're lying, or we're going to torture you until you admit that you're lying and then kill you. So Galileo, not wanting all of his life's work to be destroyed, not wanting to be tortured, not wanting to be killed himself, is going to go and admit that he's lying, kind of sarcastically, but enough that it's going to make the judge happy. One of the most important things about the scientific revolution is that it's going to be questioning traditional knowledge that's been taught by the church and has been believed for hundreds and hundreds of years. One of the most important things that was believed for so long, that was studied by Aristotle, Ptolemy, they believed in something called the geocentric model, which was saying that the Earth was the center of our universe because God must have put humans at the center. The Bible seemed to agree with that. The church went with it. So it was believed for hundreds and hundreds of years throughout the Middle Ages that the Earth was the center of the universe. It's not till a man by the name of Copernicus begins to study and use logic, reason, observation, experiments, these type of things that we associate with the scientific revolution, to start to have the idea that no, the Earth isn't the center. The Earth is actually moving and rotating around the sun, which is the center, and all the planets rotate around it. But it's important to know that speaking out and saying these things, you could be deemed a heretic because you're speaking out against the traditional teachings of the church. He is never going to completely be able to prove his view in his lifetime, but based on his logic and ideas, he's pretty sure that the heliocentric model is the correct way that the universe worked. So two scientists after him, Kepler and then Galileo, are going to use observation experiments. Galileo is going to use his telescope to observe the movement of the planets to, in fact, agree with Copernicus that yes, the heliocentric model is true, but the geocentric one that had been believed for so long is not. Important to know, the church is going to put him on trial. Pope Urban VII is going to say either, well, you're going to get tortured until you admit that you're lying, or just admit that you're lying now and that you were going against the church. So Galileo wants to avoid torture, doesn't want to die. He recants his findings, says, I was wrong, whatever, and he's put on house arrest until he dies years later. It just shows you that the church was not really accepting of these new ideas, at least not publicly. Throughout the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment era, the church is actually going to be secretly paying and financing scientists to go and study certain things because they want to know as well if all of the things they've been teaching are true, but mostly done privately because they don't want people reaching out and questioning them. This new questioning attitude is called skepticism, which is basically questioning any traditional beliefs that you believe to be true and not believing anything that can't be repeated, observed using logic, experiments, and everything to prove something to be true instead of just it's that way because the church said so. Also, that you learned about in science class during the scientific revolution, something called the scientific method, the different step process into proving whether something is true or not based on observation, experiments, logic, those type of things. So those are all buzzwords that you want to identify with the scientific revolution. One of these men that's going to be important during the scientific revolution, besides Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo that we've already mentioned, is someone by the name of Sir Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon is going to come up with something called the inductive method, which is basically starting off observing something, creating a hypothesis about it, and retesting it over and over and over again to see if the same thing keeps happening. And it was believed that you can come up with these universal laws or universal truths if you conduct an experiment over and over again and the same result happens. That's what makes something into a law. So that was Francis Bacon's idea. So making sure that you identify inductive reasoning with Francis Bacon, and then Descartes starts with a D, deductive reasoning that we covered a lot, basically deducing back based on logic and ideas, finding out what things can be true. So around this time, in 1660, one of the first kind of scientific societies is going to open. The Royal Society in England is going to be a famous one, but basically in a lot of major cities in Western Europe, Berlin, Florence, Paris, all of these cities are going to have their own scientific societies, people that get together, talk about things, work on experiments, share information with each other to try and find out truths about the universe and where we live. And it's really going to jumpstart the scientific knowledge and beliefs of this time period. And again, the funding from these are going to come from monarchs, governments, and the church is going to be publicly against it, but is going to be actually paying for some of those things in private, though people didn't know that at the time because, again, they didn't want people reaching out and questioning the church. They were paying because they wanted to prove their ideas to kind of be true, and after their ideas were proven true by science, they wanted to share it with the people, so that kind of thing. And one of the last scientists we're going to talk about is Sir Isaac Newton. He's probably going to be one of the most brilliant minds until Albert Einstein years later. Newton is going to be alive in the mid 1600s, the early 1700s. Basically, he's going to have his theory on gravity. He's going to say that the universe is basically like a machine that was created by God, but after God created it, he kind of stepped away. See if you remember what that was called. But we're going to get into that a little bit later as well. But just knowing that, like, he didn't believe in magic and all of these other things, he believed that there were universal scientific laws why the Earth functioned the way it did. The AP Euro exam isn't going to ask you to memorize any of these things, but it's really important to know how all of these people are going to change the society that we live in because they're questioning these traditional beliefs that have been believed for so long. So it's not necessarily about memorizing their specific things and exactly what they did. I mean, those are helpful to use for specific information for the SAQs, DBQ, or LEQ, but it's more about knowing that the scientific revolution was all about questioning traditional ideas, speaking out against it, the new ideas that are going to be spread. And oh, by the way, that printing press that was invented is going to help spread these ideas as well. So the scientific revolution is going to lead into another time period called the Enlightenment Era or the Age of Reason, where philosophies or philosophers are going to start to, again, continue to question traditional ideas. The major difference between the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment Era, the scientific revolution is going to focus more on our natural world around us, the solar system, gravity, scientific things, when Enlightenment is more focused on people, the social element, about racism, hatred, the way some people are treated, why social classes are different, and kind of questioning the role between people and the government. So while they're both about the spread of new ideas, they're both questioning traditional authority, they're both helped spread by the printing press, they both have societies that get together and talk about these ideas. The scientific revolution is going to be more focused on the universe and natural laws, things around us like that, while the Enlightenment era is going to be more focused on again, the social element, people, how they're treated, social classes, and people's relationship with the government. One of the ways that the Enlightenment era is going to contradict the Middle Ages is during the Middle Ages, you were supposed to suffer. You were supposed to live a suffering but noble life on earth so you'd eventually go to heaven and be happy. But the Enlightenment era is going to kind of get rid of that. It's going to say you shouldn't have to rely on God or magic or any of other spiritual things in order to be happy. That situation should be created by the people and the government. That you should be happy in the world that you're in, and basically there's certain steps the government and people need to take in order for that to happen. And all the way up until this point, we've talked about so many different religious conflicts and things of that nature that have taken place, and it's important to know that that was one of the biggest thing that Enlightenment philosophies or philosophers had a problem with. Basically, they see people that are dying because they believe in different gods, different forces that apparently govern our solar system, that govern the universe type thing. But they're going to say that toleration is an important part of being human, whether it's about religious beliefs or anything else, that in order to be enlightened, you also need to be tolerant of other cultures and others' beliefs. And if you were waiting for me to get back to the thing I was talking about, where God created the world that we live in, kind of like a clockmaker, but then just step back and let whatever was going to happen based on how he created it, that term is called deism. One of these people that's going to speak out against religious intolerance, the social classes in France, basically bigotry in any type of way, is going to be Voltaire. Voltaire was a believer in free speech, that you should have the freedom to express yourself without having to worry about the king arresting you, throwing you in jail, or executing you, or even worse, that you should be able to speak your mind and have, like I said, that freedom of expression, which is part of the United States government today. Another one of these thinkers is Diderot, and he is going to be responsible for coming up with the first encyclopedia, which is basically trying to take all of the world's known knowledge and put it in one place that people can understand, like trying to accumulate all of that knowledge and put it into one area. The only problem with that is they only wanted to include factual things or things that you could prove. Religion is based on faith, not fact. That's not saying that religion isn't correct. It's saying that in order to believe, you have to have a certain amount of faith. Faith and science don't necessarily go together. So because they only wanted to include things that were true, there's going to be nothing about religion in the first encyclopedias that are going to be created. And you can see how that would cause a lot of social problems at that point in time. Another philosopher that we talked about is Baron de Montesquieu. His major work is The Spirit of the Laws, and that's where the United States gets their idea for three different branches of government. We have the legislative, executive, and the judicial. Basically, so not one person has all control of the government. He saw that as a way to make sure that the government doesn't get corrupt because of the checks and balances and things that are always supporting one another instead of one absolute monarch having all of the power, which was how a lot of 18th century governments in Europe were being run. Another philosophy that we're going to talk about is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He's going to write the social contract. And while John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, had their different views on government and people and how it should obey, Jean-Jacques Rousseau had social contract, basically said that there was a social contract that existed between all of the people living in an area, that they gave up certain rights for the common good, and the governments were there to carry out the people's will. And if the government wasn't carrying out the people's will, then it should be overthrown. This is really similar to John Locke's idea that unfair governments should be overthrown if they're not meeting the needs of the people. John Locke's major work was Two Treatises on Liberty. Major ideas were everyone is entitled to natural rights, life, liberty, property. Thomas Hobbes was the philosopher that kind of had a negative view of human nature, saw people as corrupt, brutal, nasty, and said that they needed a really strong ruler to kind of keep control over them, and that the government didn't need to follow the order of the people, that the people needed to follow the order of the government. Voltaire and Rousseau are usually the philosophers that come up the most based on recent exams, but of course it can be any of them. It's important to know that Voltaire was all about religious toleration, opposed ignorance, superstition, that type of thing, believed in freedom of speech, and Rousseau was all going to be about that general will. He's also going to have this view, a book called Emily, which is basically a view on education, that children are naturally good, but society is going to corrupt them. In Rousseau's book, he's basically going to say that they need to get rid of this like rigid education class and let education be more natural, learning, interconnect us with the world type things, which is going to be what's going to eventually lead into, that's why Rousseau is so often identified with the Romantic era, because that's a lot of his ideas, being more inclined with nature and beauty and things of that nature, rather than the social, rigid education that was taking place at that time for the upper class students. And if he would have gotten his way, there probably would be no AP Euro class. We'd probably just go sit in the field and learn and talk about nature and how it's won. And I'm going to move on to the next topic now. The major economic policy that we've talked about so far since the age of exploration has been mercantilism, benefiting the mother country. There's only so much, governments are in strict control of it. But the physiocrats are going to be a group of people that start to speak out against mercantilism and want governments to take their hands off or be more laissez-faire with business. One of the main people that's going to be involved with this is Adam Smith, who's going to write the book The Wealth of Nations, which is basically going to be the fundamentals of laissez-faire capitalism that we've covered a lot in class. The government should keep their hands off of business. Governments should only be for protecting people's rights, protecting against invasion, protecting people's property, enforcing contracts, that type of thing, but have a free market or a market economy where basically businesses are allowed to operate how they want and what the economy dictates without any government interference. So it's important to note someone that would be on the exact opposite of Adam Smith would be Jean-Baptiste Colbert from France. Remember, he was the major person behind the mercantilist ideas in France because he wanted them to take over other countries, use slave labor, that type of thing to make France rich. But Adam Smith, on the other hand, just wanted to keep his hands off of that, let self-interested individuals go in this free market, and that was what would be the best for not only those individuals, but for the rest of people living in society. Enlightenment era that's going on, it's going to obviously start among the upper class in society because they're going to be the ones that have the ability to read and actually study these things. But it's also going to affect quite a few rulers in the 18th century in Europe. And this is called the enlightened despots or enlightened despotism, which is basically when people are going to start to use philosophers, monarchs that have this absolute power are going to start using that power instead to get whatever they want to support the good for their people. That's why Mr. Weaver personally believes that a one-party system would work wonderfully, but only if that person leading that was good, but usually good people don't want that type of power, usually it corrupts people, but I digress. It's important to know that these enlightened monarchs or these enlightened despots, whatever you want to call them, aren't going to want a democracy. They don't want to put their hands in the people. They're the government in the hands of the people. They basically agree with Thomas Hobbes that people are not smart enough, not capable of governing themselves. So having a strong monarch was still important, but these monarchs were going to use that ultimate power they had to benefit the lives of their people. The best known enlightened rulers in Europe are going to be Catherine the Great of Russia, Frederick the Great of Prussia, and Joseph II of Austria, which we'll get into here in a minute. The Great in Russia is going to open a school for girls, make education more available for girls, correspond with Voltaire and Diderot and communicate back and forth with them and communicate with them about Enlightenment ideas, is going to allow Jews to live in Russia without persecuting them, and even tries to start passing like law codes to protect the serfs. The only problem with that is the nobility in Russia is going to rebel against her, and she kind of gives into that noble pressure to kind of stop any future rebellions. She's going to pretty much give those nobles complete power over the serfs, and serfdom is going to continue in Russia for a while after it. So while she really believed herself to be this enlightened ruler, like I said, she's going to write to the different philosophers. She's going to allow religious toleration. Jewish people open a school for girls, try to change the law code. It's going to be met with resistance, mostly by the nobles that live there. And in return, she ends to stop herself from being overthrown or dealing with rebellions. She is going to allow them to keep power over the serfs, which really isn't an enlightened idea. She's also going to go to war with the Ottoman empires and use some brutal tactics there. So Catherine the Great was enlightened in some ways, but you can also see how in others she's still not going to be afraid to do things that are going to keep her in power over benefiting her people. Like a truly good ruler, would they worry about a rebellion and being overthrown, or would they care about the majority of peasants that are living under feudalist, under really bad conditions? So I guess that's kind of for you to decide as well. And the last thing, the place that we always talk about in Europe, poor this country, poor Poland. She's going to annex Poland. She's not the only one that's going to take over parts of Poland, but that's why Poland is going to kind of cease to exist going into the 1800s, because Catherine the Great is going to take over part of it and it's going to disappear off the map. So the next person we'll talk about is Frederick the Great, who's going to be in charge of Prussia from 1740 to 1786. So some of his enlightened ideas, he, just like Catherine the Great, is going to allow religious toleration. He's going to encourage the Huguenots from France and Jews from Poland to come to Prussia, and live there without, having to worry about being prosecuted. It's going to support the scientific revolution and the questioning of ideas. Is going to, again, just like Catherine the Great, write back and forth with Voltaire and invite him to come live at his palace. Is going to get rid of like torture and like they're not going to torture people anymore. The only case where they're still going to torture people is treason and some other things. But he says he's going to get rid of torture, which is a big thing at this point. So again, religious toleration of different people, wrote back and forth of different philosophers, is going to mostly get rid of torture in his country. So enlightened, but then again, also as Catherine the Great. If you remember what the nobles are called in Prussia, they're called Junkers. He is going to continue to give them more power so they support him. So the Junkers or the nobles in Prussia are still going to have complete control over their serfs. Again, not a very enlightened idea. The same thing with Catherine the Great in Russia. Talked about Peter the Great a while ago, but Peter the Great of Russia and Frederick the Great of Prussia are two good individuals to kind of compare because they both did really similar things, wanting to make their countries much stronger, modernize it, rebuild the military, take over land, that type of thing. So just two individuals to keep in mind. Enlightened monarch or enlightened despot that we're going to talk about is Joseph II of Austria. Unlike Catherine the Great and unlike Frederick the Great, Joseph II of Austria is going to abolish serfdom and basically going to give the serfs a lot more freedom than they were used to pretty much in any other eastern part of Europe at this time. So Joseph II gets rid of serfdom, reduces the influence of the church, because remember, enlightened ideas believe in religious toleration. If the church is controlling things, that's not religious, that's not good for enlightenment beliefs. He's going to also allow all religious toleration for Jews and all sorts of Christians. He's also going to end the policy of torture in his country. So out of all of the enlightened monarchs, he's probably going to be the most enlightened, in my opinion anyway, because he's going to do a lot of the same things as Catherine the Great and Frederick the Great. But on top of that, he's going to free the serfs. And with that, you can probably guess the nobles aren't going to be too happy with that. After he dies and Leopold takes over after him, he's going to like re-roll all of the changes that he made. And serfdom is going to, again, take hold in Austria all the way until 1848. And that year should hopefully sound familiar. So knowing that he's going to make a lot of changes during his lifetime, but then they're going to be changed after his death because the nobles don't support it because they're losing a lot of their power over the serfs. And this next part now has nothing to do with the scientific revolution, well, a little bit if you want to include it in the agricultural revolution, and really nothing to do with the Enlightenment era, but it's the last kind of small section we have before we get to the French Revolution, which is directly tied to the Enlightenment era, so we might as well cover it now. I feel like we went through the scientific and Enlightenment eras kind of quickly, but I feel like we get the majority of it. It's knowing the people, their main beliefs, the enlightened monarchs, and obviously, as we talk about the French Revolution, we're going to talk about King Louis XVI, King Louis XIV, how neither one of them were enlightened whatsoever. They all had that absolute power for themselves. And we've already talked about different absolute rulers when we talked about absolutism early on. So now we're going to go and talk about the agricultural revolution for a little bit. In the early 1700s, most peasants lived on what they called this open field system, where it wasn't really their land, but they were allowed to live there, subsistent farm, grow enough for what they need and survive that way. They usually used a 3-crop rotation method where they would grow things in 3 fields and then leave one fallow or empty. The reason they left one empty is, okay, agricultural tip for you, you can't grow the same crops in the same place every year because crops, when they grow, use nutrients out of the soil. So if you're growing the same thing in the same spot every single year, those nutrients are going to get sucked up out of the ground and your crops aren't going to grow as successfully. A guy by the nickname of Turnip Townsend is going to come up with the 4-crop rotation system, which is basically instead of leaving one field empty, he's going to talk about growing turnips because turnips actually replenish a lot of important nutrients in the soil. And so not only are you replenishing the nutrients in the soil, but now you have turnips that you can eat or feed to livestock. So now you can keep your livestock through the winter instead of having to kill them when there's no food. So the 4-crop rotation system is going to have a major impact on the amount of food available in Western Europe. It's important to know in the Low Countries, the Dutch, they are going to have to use a levy system to keep their fields dry. And actually, in times of war, especially with Philip II, when they're going to be invaded, they're going to let those kind of levees go and flood their own fields so that no one invader can come in and use them. But just knowing the levee system in the lowlands and the Netherlands is another example of people adapting to their environment, and during the agricultural revolution, allowing them to have more fertile growing space because it's not going to be underwater. Another invention that's going to take place is something called the seed drill. The seed drill was invented by Jethro Tull, and basically it's a machine that gets pulled by a horse or cattle something, and it digs a hole for the seed. It drops the seeds into the hole and then covers it up all in one motion. The reason this is so important is it can do like 3 different tasks in one sweep through, saving a lot of time, manpower, money. The seeds aren't going to blow away in the wind or get eaten by birds, and it saves you a lot of time. So it allows people to govern or plant much more efficiently. And one of the last things, not having to do with agriculture, but having to do with animals, a guy by the name of Robert Bakewell is going to come up with something called selective breeding, which is basically when they're going to breed the most genetically pleasing animals with each other in order to get more genetically pleasing animals out of them. Basically, so you would mate 2 big animals together in the belief that their babies and their offspring would be big as well. It can feed more people and improve genetics in that way. And that turned out to be very, very successful. The only problem with this is all of these inventions are great, right? It allows you to farm much more efficiently. But because of that, people started to be able to grow more than just what they needed themselves. They can now grow food to sell or cash crops. So what's going to happen is these wealthy landowners are basically, especially in England, going to kick these peasants off of the open field that they've lived on for so long and put up fences. This is called the enclosure movement. They're going to hire some of those people to stay there and work the land for them. Other people are going to have to leave and start moving to cities in order to find work or other things to do. So it's important to know that all of these technologies and new innovations that we just talked about during the agricultural revolution lead to the enclosure movement, because now people can farm their fields more efficiently and make much more money off them, which is when people are going to start to move to cities and we start to see urbanization happen, especially, like I said, in England. And again, so we just talked about how the enclosure movement is going to affect the peasants in England, in the lowlands, the Netherlands in the 1700s. In most other places throughout Europe, peasants are going to be able to resist it a little bit longer, but the enclosure movement is going to be very successful and to nobles, but very hurtful to the peasants in England and the lowlands. It's important to know that even with these new innovations and things, this is when the food supply is going to become much more stable. But through a lot of period 1 and 2, the food supply is going to be very unstable because of crop failures, because of war. One of the tactics of war was when you invaded a country, going in and burning all of their crops, because not only are you defeating them militarily, but you're taking away their food supply. Soldiers can't fight without food, trying to get them to surrender earlier. So different famines are going to take place. They're not uncommon, like I said, because of crop failures, war, and other situations that arise in Europe in periods 1 and 2. One of these most famous famines is the Irish potato famine that's going to happen later on in the 1800s. But it's important to know the potato is going to become such an important food in Ireland and Europe in general, because it's such a calorie-dense food that people can live on it and sustain life for a very, very long time. It grows under the ground. It can grow in a lot of different conditions. So it's a very important crop that was brought over from the New World. So because of this agricultural revolution and the more stable food supply in the 1700s, around the year 1700, there's going to be about 120 million people living on the continent of Europe as a whole. And closer to 1800, there's now 190 million people. So a jump of like 70 million. The most major, like percentage-wise, is going to be a huge population growth in the countries of England and France during the 1700s. Talking a little bit about family life before the year 1750. Most young married European couples lived in nuclear families, so like how we normally do today. These large, huge households weren't common, especially in Western Europe. Most couples, despite what we might think, are actually going to wait until their mid to late 20s to marry, kind of like they do now, because it was important to make sure before you went off and got married that you were self-sufficient, that you learned some type of trade, that you were able to make a living by yourself before you went off and got married. Marriage wasn't necessarily free and open. There were strict laws, and like your parents had a say in who you were going to marry at this point. Not quite arranged marriages, but it wasn't completely up to the people and based on love like it is today. After 1750, though, you should hopefully identify the year 1750 as like kind of the start of the first industrial revolution, where we talk about the domestic system or the putting out system, where those people are going to bring like cloth out to people living in rural areas and have them weave it into cloth or clothing, that type of thing, and then bring it back and sell it in the cities. The reason that's so important is because now people are going to have extra money. One of the main reasons people got married before 1750 was financial security. Now that people are going to be able to make a little bit more money by themselves, marriage is going to start to decrease a little bit. Women are going to leave the house and kind of served in more domestic roles. It's kind of like maids, house, like people certain domestic roles for wealthy families, basically learning how to take care of a family and everything before they have their own. And it's important to know that after couples do get married too, a lot of babies, whether high up in social classes or low peasants, are not going to survive. There's going to be a very high mortality rate for infants and all the way throughout teenage years. So people, even in a way, try not to get too attached to their kids, if that even makes sense, because it wasn't uncommon to have multiple infant mortalities in the same family when having kids, because you got to remember, contraception and things like that really don't exist on a wide scale at this point. Some other improvements that are going to be to life in the late 1700s, because of all the agricultural improvements, more availability of food supply. People are going to start living longer. It's going to move. It's going to like increase the life expectancy in Europe. That potato with the better farming techniques, a lot more stable food supply. When it comes to vaccines and like medicine, there aren't a ton of advancements at this point, but one major like advancement is in 1796, the first smallpox like vaccine. So people, like, that was a disease that wiped out a lot of people, got people very sick. So when Edward Jenner performed that first like vaccination in 1796, that's a very big deal and is going to take some time to catch on, but still a very important medical advancement in history. And I guess the last major thing we'll talk about here, and I know we've been jumping all over a lot, is witchcraft. Knowing that the 16th and 17th centuries were known for all of the different witchcraft trials and everything else, it's important in the Americas, in Europe, pretty much all around. It's important to know that old widowed women were usually the target of these witchcraft trials. The reason for them is basically women were believed to be weaker, in a sense, than men, that they were more easy for the devil to manipulate and take over, especially old widowed women, because they usually lived kind of on the outskirts of town. They didn't have anybody to stick up for them if they were accused, so they were just a very easy target for people. All of the different religious wars and everything else that was going on, all of the different things that were believed, the supernatural forces, it basically created a lot of tension. Older widowed women were that easy target. Witchcraft is going to start to, not that witchcraft itself is going to start to decline, but the persecution of witchcraft is going to start to decline into the 1700s with the scientific revolution and Enlightenment era, just because now people are starting to base things again on observation, experimentation, logic, reason, actually thinking about things. So when these ideas start to spread, people start to realize that, okay, well, maybe witchcraft isn't either a real thing, not as common. People stop accusing because they're more focused on things that can be proven like that. That's not to say that it doesn't continue in some areas a little bit longer. And I bet if you go out and ask 100 people today somewhere around, people are still going to say they believe in witches and that sort of thing. But it's important to know that it's going to come to an end because of the scientific and Enlightenment ideas that we talked about earlier. It's really important to know who was targeted, the reasons why they were targeted, as we just said, and for the reasons that those witchcraft trials are going to come to an end. So that's it. We've talked about the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment era, the agricultural revolution, enlightened monarchs. We've talked a little bit about social and economic life in this time. We talked about Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations. This video kind of went all over the place, but we're kind of finishing up the last time period before we get into the French Revolution. So the main two components of this are the scientific revolution and Enlightenment era, but all of the other information is kind of more about life at this point in time and what life was like through periods 1 and 2. Skepticism is a super important word. Deism is a super important word. Knowing all of those different philosophers, scientists, and just an idea of what their overall major beliefs were, that you'd be able to write about it in a short answer response or an LEQ, and that you'd be able to pick out of a multiple choice question document. Again, I hope these are helpful. You know so much more than you think you do. Trust yourselves. Keep working.